Alleluia. Om Mani Padme. Om. Allah.
You're watching Harmony in Diversity. Norm Currie is my name. And we're speaking again to Rabbi Dr Shimon Cowen. Rabbi, last week we were talking about the Noahide laws. And you established a beautiful description of them, which was such that it looked as though they laid the foundation for a lot of the society as we know it today. In conversation with you, you've mentioned a fascinating word, a word which it would appear that you have coined, hedonimat.
Well, this word hedonimat makes a conscious allusion to another similar word which people heard for the last 70 years. If they lived during part or all of that time, it was called diamat. Diamat was a short expression for dialectical materialism. And it was the philosophy which animated as that once vast empire of communism, which we both remember. Mm-hmm. Dialectical materialism was a doctrine which saw nature and the human being in a dialectical interaction, a series of forms of production which would eventually, according to Marxian theory, lead to the overthrow of capitalism and usher in a new real world order of communism or socialism. Okay, so we know what became of that. But that was a materialistic doctrine. It also opposed religion. But in our time, we have a new kind of materialism, which I thought might best be called hedonistic materialism. And playing on the diamat, I thought, let's call it hedonimat. And just as diamat was a doctrine which became de rigueur, absolutely entrenched in all intellectual, media, academic thinking in those regions, those societies, so also this doctrine has also become installed with most rigid political correctness in so much of our society, media, academia, and so on and so forth. You must adhere to hedonimat. What is hedonimat? What is this hedonistic materialism? Well, it shares with the old diamat the concept that basically the physical world is all you've got. It doesn't know much about the soul or about God. To the contrary, it is a mixture of ignorance and hostility towards both of these concepts. But what it added, or what distinguished it from the earlier materialism, was, if you like, a Freudian element which focused on human gratification, instinctual gratification. The human being is dominated by the quest for pleasure, and therefore the pleasure and what I called the freely morphing human desire was something which was an ethical benchmark in some sense. And that is why you've had in our contemporary society such an incredible fluidity in the whole concept of sexual relationships and familial relationships and so on and so forth, because the principal notion has been that the human being is entitled to what he or she feels, or she desires. That itself constitutes a standard for morality. Not only that, it tends to merge the human world with the animal world, so that whilst respect for the environment is a fine thing, this hedonimat sees, if you like, the whole of creation as one kind of animal kingdom, in which humans are human animals, two-legged animals, but which they share, they form one commonwealth with nature. And just as animals are instinctual beings, humans are instinctual beings. Let us allow instinct to be our guide. But of course, human beings are worse than animals in some ways, can be, because animals do no more than they're programmed to do. Human beings can be quite ingenious in their aberrations and in their cruelty and in their in the scheming which goes to overturn and uproot traditional values. So basically, Hedonimat is a philosophy which is quite indifferent to the concept of existing structures with a hierarchy of values, with notion of differences and different roles. The concept of difference is not incompatible with unity. We are, all of us, different. We have different strengths and different characters. And traditional values saw that different people preeminently are suited to different kinds of roles. Sometimes they can do the same roles. But at all events, it made the human being receptive to values and traditional values. Hedonimat says, what values are there? Let us see in which direction the human being morphs according to instinct and desire. And society will follow suit. There is no, yes.
Yeah. When we were discussing last week the Noahide laws, there seemed to be throughout your considerable description of them the constancy of reverence. Reverence, how does that fit in with hedonimism?
Well, reverence is very important because basically what reverence signifies is that the human being who possesses a soul, not everybody is conscious of it and it's been much repressed in contemporary culture, knows that our task is to imitate the divine, to model ourselves on God's ways and this godly morality. And reverence is the message that that this is our duty. We have obligations and so on and so forth. So therefore, this is a very important thing. But another feature of Hedonimat, which I should have mentioned, perhaps elaborated more, is that Hedonimat represses the spiritual faculty within the human being. It virtually does not know it. And therefore, it loses that key pilot within the human being, that pilot light or that pilot function, which is to take the person back, so to speak, to those key obligations, those key values for which the human being was created to bring into actuality. So yes, we have to know to whom and to what we owe reverence, but you can't have that without a sense of the human soul.
Yes, that's fascinating. In the context of what we're going to discuss after the break is the implication of legislation and regulation in this hedonimat climate. We will go to a break and we'll return to discuss this fascinating subject. Welcome back to Harmony and Diversity. Norm Currie is my name. And we're speaking with Rabbi Dr Shimon Cowen. We've been talking about the hedonimat. Rabbi, hedonimatic, and I'm stretching your word here, sits behind, I suspect, things like the Relationship Bill of 2008. You have some views on that.
Yes, this was a bill which is a very enigmatic bill, which I think I've only recently come to understand clearly. What does it mean, understand? Why? What was there to understand? Didn't the legislators have a clear intention? The answer is no. As with so much legislation, it was the result of pressures, and nobody really understood, perhaps, what its full import was and its significance and its impact would be. Briefly, in a nutshell, as you know, the law was, as it is now, that marriage is something which can only be between a man and a woman. Now, what you had was a homosexual lobby which wanted to have marriage-like relationships for homosexual couples. And this couldn't be done under the existing federal framework. So therefore, what you had was that the Victorian government, which was the last government, decided to reconstitute the law of de facto unions by pulling out chunks from the Marriage Act and putting it in, so as to make a de facto relationship between two people almost identical to marriage. So, for example, they would, not only would there was matters of superannuation and so on and so forth, would they have like a relationship of a married couple, but also there would be property division upon breakup. There would be maintenance on breakup. There would be a whole series of features in which de facto unions in fact came to resemble marriage in all but name. And that was because they basically wanted the equivalent of homosexual marriage, the benefits of homosexual marriage. Why is that hedonimet? Because, as I mentioned before, without in any way seeking to treat without compassion, never in individuals' various inclinations. Nevertheless, the divine template does not consider this is the proper union. The proper union is one of man and woman, but society was agitating for this union, together with all sorts of other different kinds of unions, and the legislation therefore responded by saying, "We will make you an imitation of marriage." However, it satisfied certain political groups for a short time. It didn't in the long run, because we saw that they wanted more. They didn't want that. They ultimately wanted the full thing. They wanted marriage. They wanted the full stamp of marriage on it, and that came later. But in the meantime, it did something actually quite harmful, this bill. And it did something quite harmful to heterosexual couples. Because what it really did was it endowed a casual, essentially a non-committed relationship, or without the commitment of marriage, with a whole series of benefits, also liabilities, because people don't quite realize that by living together now, they can't simply walk away from each other. There is property division and maintenance and all of that. But maybe I think that's the lower realms of consciousness. But it gave them a whole series of benefits. Now, I think in many ways that's an unfortunate development. I say why? Because really what it did was it rewarded non-commitment. In other words, a person can get together in an essentially uncommitted relationship and have all the benefits. Very crudely put, if you forgive me for putting it this way, we use the expression, if you've got the milk, why do you need the cow? The cow is not a reference to the woman or to the man, but it's just a term which brings out this notion. If I have all the benefits, then what do I need to care for this beast? What do I need to care for this entity? And so this is in fact what happened. And it's a classic case of legislation with far-reaching consequences, which simply responded to a push for a new gratification, for a new kind of wish, basically in the society, without measuring up that wish, the validity of that wish, with standards of universal ethics and the institutions which are built on them. Yes. So it is, in my view, and a lot of people, and I myself was not quite clear of how the impact of this legislation and what its real impact would be, how it would come out. But at all events, we live in a society in which 1 in every 3 children is born out of wedlock. I think it's most unfortunate. It's a situation because children need a mother and a father. Children need a context of commitment, and all this is done, really, is to create relationships which are fortified in their conveniences and their benefits without the concomitant commitment. Bad for them, in my view, and bad for their children. I'm sorry to put it so bad. I don't wish to offend anybody, but I don't think that a service was done to our society by introducing this bill.
No, it tends to be a reflection of the fact, and I think these figures are right, that 70% of marriages are civil marriages, not religious marriages. So this legislation behaves in some ways as though the civil marriages are all there is. The religious marriages. Well,
in my view, I disagree with you slightly, because a lot of civil marriages they may not have a religious context, but at least it's a formal contract.
Yes.
And that formal contract means that whether religion's in it or not, we as a couple commit and voluntarily commit to each other with all sorts of financial mutual financial obligations willingly entered into. The fact it doesn't start that way. It doesn't start as a statement, as a public statement of commitment. So it's less than a formal civil marriage.
Yes, but it doesn't have the reverence element to it of being a union in the eyes of God. But we'll carry on with that point because we need to have our break. So we'll go to a break and we'll return shortly. Welcome back to Harmony and Diversity. Norm Currie is my name, and we're speaking with Rabbi Cowen. Rabbi, we were speaking about the Relationship Bill 2008. I wonder, I know you have an opinion on this, but can we have a look at the Abortion Bill 2008 and its implications and its hedonimat
features,
yes.
And also its relationship to the Noahide laws, because as you know, in the last discussion we had, we spoke about the Relationships Bill and how that relates to the ultimate concept of the proper union of a human marriage, which should be which should be a relationship where the partners have actually designated themselves in a formal, committed way, in some sense, or there's certainly a conscious commitment, and that's missing. So that we don't get a very big tick for that particular Noahide law. But another very serious area in which society is lacking is in the area of killing. Now, killing is a word. Everybody would agree that killing is a bad thing, but they don't really appreciate how far that reaches. Abortion is a form of killing. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't very special and rare circumstances where abortion may be permitted. For example, if there's a real threat to the mother's life, or let us say a baby was a product of incest or rape, or there might be kinds of radical deformity which couldn't exist. There may be certain cases. However, the regime of abortion on demand, which this bill in 2008 brought in, is something which is clearly against the Noahide laws. And again, it's driven by a materialistic and hedonistic culture, hedonimat, as you've put it. As I put it, the word seems to be getting currency on this program, at least. At all events, this was of course a law, or so-called a law which responded to a body or a group of people who said that a woman has a jurisdiction over everything in her own body, including this life. And no questions can be asked about her ability to dispose of it at any time up to 24 weeks, which is what the bill allowed. Bang, no questions asked, abortion. And beyond that, up to birth, if she could get two opinions to support it. Now, this notion that she has jurisdiction over another life, because it's within her body, is not something which is true, according to Noahide law. As we mentioned, maybe it was the previous program, she doesn't really have jurisdiction over her own body, because we said suicide is something which is not permitted, morally acceptable, because our body and our soul are something which God gave us for a purpose. It's not ours to dispose of at will. It's given in trust. Now, if our own body is not our own, surely the little body inside is also not our own, also to dispose of at will. So, this notion, however, that I can do what I want, because I feel this and I feel that, without a legitimate, really legitimate reason for doing so, based on universal ethical grounds, is again a terrible expression, in my opinion, of the hedonimat culture, which I should tell you also goes as far as proposing sometimes that a child up to the age of 1 month could be killed. There are those who unfortunately propose the notion that if this person is a life, here's a child with a Down syndrome, is a life which they deem as not a reasonable life, not a life which could be properly enjoyed, etc., then you could kill a living child. This is an extreme extension of it. It's a post-birth abortion, or some horrific concept of the same notion. Again, The notion that if this is something which pains me or pains what I think would pain the bearer of that life, I can terminate it because I'm entitled to that. I'm entitled ultimately to the fulfillment of my own wants in themselves. So this is something which is very bad. And it's deeply destructive, because when life becomes disposable in this manner, then it leads also to, it doesn't matter where it leads, it's bad in itself without a slippery slope, right. But it leads to a euthanasia. Yes. It leads to voluntary euthanasia, it leads to assisted suicide, it leads to this infanticide, which I think is the most grotesque of all manifestations of the same thing. It is a disrespect for life. Yes. Life which God gave, which has value in itself. And this is a very important thing. You see, the notion that a life which is not performing all of the functions that it wants to, let's say a terminally ill person or even a person who's mentally retarded, all that looks at is the physical dimension, yes. Physical and mental dimension. It doesn't recognize there could be a very special spiritual existence within that person, a spark of God, something divine. Again, Hedonimat shows its complete tone deafness and its blindness to the spiritual within.
What's being suggested to me, I'm thinking back in the 60s, I'm thinking back to the me generation, and I'm just wondering whether that me generation has not planted the seeds which have given rise to this hedonistic focus.
Well, that me generation was unphilosophical hedonism. What we have now is philosophical and principled hedonism, yes. And that's Hedonimat.
Yes.
And the notion, there's a terrible arrogance, and everybody now identifies it as political correctness. It's installed itself as a doctrine in many of the corridors of academia and media, bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. And the abortion bill actually brought out its degree of hegemony in our society, because it contained a clause which is really almost unparalleled in the whole world. What it said was that when a doctor is approached to perform an abortion under the legislation, he or she must either do it, and if they don't want to do it, they must refer to another. Now, the knowledge that a person with a conscientious moral objection must refer to another, must facilitate it, is a deep invasion of conscience. Yes. In fact, the doctor is compelled to do an act. Yes. And this is in a case of how Hedonimat has actually entered coercively into our culture.
Yes, it's quite, when you put it in that context, it's quite frightening. But what we have is even more frightening is time itself. And we've been discussing what's absolutely fascinating topic. We can't go next episode, but would you agree to coming back some later time to speak further about these issues, Rabbi?
It'll be a pleasure.
Norm. Thank you very much. You've been watching Harmony and Diversity, and thank you for watching.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om, Allahu